Great. So Dr. Alicia Togni is going to give us, as I just said, a lecture on Husserl's Phenomenology of Interiority. And she obtained a joint PhD in philosophy from Universidade del Salento and Université Paris-Sorbonne. She carried out her research at the Husserl Archive, Cologne, where she also got a scholarship from Artes, Graduate School for Humanities. And she also researched on the Husserl Archives in Paris. She was a visiting scholar at École Normale Supérieure de Paris in a bilateral exchange program. And Dr. Togni is specialized in Phenomenology of Husserl and Edith Stein as well. And she has participated, she has taken part in numerous conferences in Italy and other lands and abroad. She has also made several translations from German philosophical works, and currently she is involved in the activities of the Italian Centre for Phenomenological Research, CIRF, and among her recent publications we can name some as the following ones, starting from Husserl, Communal Life According to Edith Stein, Pourquoi une psychologie phénoménologique, Husserl, la psychologie et l'exigence phénoménologique de fondation, Brentano, Husserl and Psychological Immanence, and also reflecting about the human. I'm just translating that because
Yes.
I don't know. Could you translate that yourself? I think it would be.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
That's so reflecting about the human being, Angela Alice Bello,
Yes.
and new psychological phenomenology. So,
Yes.
and she has recently published her first monograph entitled Phenomenology and Psychology in Husserl, the Psychological Reduction. And that is it. We are very glad to have you here with us, Alicia, and the screen is yours.
Yes, okay. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I am very glad to be able to present my paper today. I will give an insight in some themes of Husserlian phenomenology that I long studied during my research stays in Cologne and in Paris. So thank you for your interest. Thank you for your attention. And let's begin. Yeah. So, can we speak of phenomenology of interiority in Husserl? What is interiority from a phenomenological point of view? In order to answer these questions, we need to address one of the most complex and fascinating themes of Husserlian thought, that of the relationship between phenomenology and psychology. Already in the logical investigation, phenomenology was characterized in terms of psychology, descriptive psychology, although this equation was promptly rejected by Husserl in the following years as misleading and, if understood in a natural way, completely incorrect. The situation becomes even more complicated as Husserl evolves. So while constantly reaffirming the difference between phenomenology and psychology, Husserl nevertheless has to acknowledge on several occasions that psychology, in particular descriptive psychology, offers its own natural starting point for the elaboration of the idea of phenomenology. And in fact, this was the way that led him to phenomenology. This way through psychology gradually turned out to be not only valid, but even advantageous and desirable, especially from the 1920s onwards. Husserl gave increasing importance to the psychological way of phenomenology. This is a way of proceeding that not only does not contradict the basic assumption of phenomenology, but even reinforces them. Inherent in the very sense of a phenomenological psychology inherent in the very sense of phenomenology itself is its evolution into a transcendental philosophy by passing through a phenomenological psychology as an intermediate stage that has the dual function of making the transcendental pedagogically accessible on the one hand, and of a renewing traditional psychology by realizing the idea of a genuinely intentional pure psychology on the other. When in fact Husserl insists on the distinction between his own phenomenology and psychology, he has as his polemical target the psychology of his time, the psychology of the tradition that is inevitably naturalistic and impregnated with positivism. In the Husserlian perspective, not even Brentano was able to detach himself completely from the model of natural sciences, remaining far from the status of a pure intentional psychology for which he yearned, which according to Husserl only the phenomenological investigation is able to guarantee. In light of this premise, it seems plausible to hypothesize a phenomenology of interiority in Husserl, if only for the fact that this constant confrontation with psychology necessarily requires the consideration in phenomenology of the same field of investigation as psychology, the interiority of a human being. Compared to psychology, Husserlian phenomenology stands on a different level and requires a completely new attitude. The internal perception of psychological type, the naive self-reflection addressed to the psychic dimension of a human being, is thus countered by a rigorous method that puts the natural attitude into brackets in order to grasp, through reduction, the experiences of pure consciousness. This is consciousness considered purely in its intentional structure, free from naturalistic connotations and therefore authentically immanent, given in an absolute self-evident way. Starting from the ideas, this kind of consciousness is increasingly configured as transcendentally pure consciousness. In this sense, Husserl states in the first volume of Ideas that it's a long and thorny way that leads to phenomenological giveness. This way passes through the grasping of psychologically immanent giveness, but to go beyond it. In this regard, psychological experience is merely propedeutic to properly phenomenological experience. Despite a certain familiarity, Verwandtschaft, phenomenology and psychology must therefore be distinguished. Their ways of proceeding are different, as are the knowledge they provide. To explain this, Husserl does not disown his debt to Brentano and Stumpf, his masters, nor does he avoid the confrontation with exponents such as Lipps, Dilthey, and Natter, who each in their own way addressed the question of the relationship between psychology and philosophy. At the same time, however, Husserl constantly feels the need to emphasize his detachment from them, and from a psychology whose structure still follows the model of natural sciences, highlighting instead the innovative character of his own methodological approach and of the objectivism that he proposes to achieve, including that of a renewal of psychology itself. Proceeding step by step with investigation, it's therefore necessary to begin by doing some remarks on methodological issues, analyzing the different ways of proceeding of the psychologist and the phenomenologist, the one by abstraction, the other by reduction, explaining how and why it's nonetheless possible to speak of a psychological reduction in phenomenology. Finally, if we want to identify the possibility of a phenomenology of interiority in Husserl, we cannot avoid a conceptual and terminological clarification of what is meant phenomenological by interiority. Starting from Husserlian texts, we need to examine everything that is commonly referred to the interiority of the human being, so psyche, soul, spirit, ego, personality, consciousness, subjectivity. Only in this way it will be possible to correctly understand not only the relationship between phenomenology and psychology, but also that between the various levels within phenomenology itself, moving from an analysis of interiority in order to reveal the transcendental dimension. So first, abstraction and reduction. According to Husserl, the psychologist and the phenomenologist have a similar approach when considering human's interiority, but the similarity is just apparent. Abstraction and reduction, these are their two methodological procedures, are fundamentally different. Going back to the origins of the concept of phenomenological reduction, we discover that in the beginning, before Husserl drew up the concept of reduction, he also made extensive reference to the operation of abstraction. The reference to abstraction should not, however, be misleading. This is why Husserl feels always the need to clarify both the nature of phenomenological inquiry and its relation to psychology. From Husserl's point of view, psychology always remains anchored to the assumptions of a natural aptitude, whereas only phenomenology can provide a solid basis for the analysis of human interiority. Certainly, lived experiences can admit both immanent descriptions in the sense of psychology and pure descriptions in the sense of phenomenology, but they cannot and should not be confused, as the phenomenological type of description is in a certain way essentially modified, wesentlich geändert, says Husserl. This modification is introduced through the methodical operation of reduction, which, as is well known, Husserl began to use from 1905 onwards. Husserl can affirm without hesitation that the only phenomena relevant to a serious investigation of interiority are those that are grasped phenomenologically as pure immanencies in the inner consciousness, excluding any empirical elements. This means radical immanence. The Husserlian elaboration of the methodical operation of reduction is also fueled by Husserl's comparison with Taddei. It's interesting to note that Taddei had already spoken of reduction in some writings of 1865-1866. This concept is also to be found in elaboration of descriptive psychology, where Taddei, with reference to those multiplicity of psychical life, the need for a psychological reduction and classification is theorized. By the term reduction, Taddei means the reconduction, Zurückführung, of a multiplicity of psychical life to a limited number, as small as possible, of non-quantitative fundamental distinctions, which require, I quote, a rather long exercise or habit to be identified, end quote. This is a question that, from Taddei's point of view, cannot be solved either by a purely mechanistic psychology or by a descriptive psychology like that of Brentano. The former, blamed for her materialism, ends up being assimilated to the natural sciences. The latter falls into a misguided combination of intellectualism and Thomism. And Husserl himself, at the outset, seems to fit into this tradition of thought, as evidenced, for example, by certain statements he made in a letter to Leibs in January 1904, or in his letter to von Hofmannsthal in January 1907. In this sense, it would almost seem that abstraction is the conceptual ancestor of phenomenological reduction. In reality, the abstraction of which Husserl speaks has a different meaning from that used in psychology. Already in the logical investigation, he distanced himself from any empirical theory of abstraction. At this point, in order to correctly understand the results and the way of proceeding of an investigation of the psychic in terms of abstraction on the one hand and reduction on the other hand, it's necessary to add a further element, introspection, the mode of inner turning through which each of us, says Husserl, grasps our experiences in their originality. Despite the fact that Husserl is critical of the common use of experience or internal perception in psychology, he must nevertheless recognize that it's precisely this introspective procedure that opens the way for a new conception of a science of the psychic. The hypothesis proposed is that psychology proceeds by abstraction in a parallel manner to the procedure of the natural sciences. Just as the natural sciences make an abstraction in order to direct themselves exclusively to what is purely physical, so psychology makes an abstraction in order to direct itself to what is purely psychic. At the same time, however, this abstraction enacted by psychology could become a methodical reduction in the phenomenological sense. It follows that by restricting the investigation to the pure psychic, we would have access to the domain of phenomenology. According to Husserl, in order to carry out a pure investigation of the psychical, the psychologist would have to put out of circuit the natural world and all that derives from it, to which he himself belongs and in which he inevitably finds himself operating. So, the psychologist who wishes to pursue a purely intentional psychology is necessarily led to enact such an operation, which, to be radical, must be universal, just as universal is the investigation he intends to carry out in order to grasp the psyche in its very essence. The human psychic, in fact, turns out to be a very wide concept. In a broad sense, the psychical is the interiority, Innerlichkeit, as opposite to the exteriority of the living body, life, which as such distinguishes the human being from other physical things. The psychic, understood in the strict sense, then unveils an internal stratification that goes deep inside and that, in order to be grasped, requires an adequate method of investigation. In a certain sense, the psychological method of abstraction can therefore be configured as a reduction to the psychic, as a delimitation of that immanent sphere of being that discloses the life of consciousness in its purity. What is needed, however, is a radical change of attitude. What is needed is the phenomenological method of epoche and reduction, so that consciousness loses its mundane sense and acquires an absolute one. Actually, this would not be a loss, but a modification. Husserl explicitly speaks of a modification, Abänderung, of the attitude of a pure psychologist who, by implementing a methodical abstraction, operates a sort of inward reduction aimed at grasping the psyche in its essence. Already in Husserl's lectures, Basic Problems of Philosophy, the expression inward reduction, innere Reduktion, is to be found, and this concept often occurs in Husserl's later writings. So, second part, let me speak about psychological reduction. At this point, we have to clarify how psychology can actually become phenomenological. In the Husserlian perspective, this transition is possible through a radical renewal of psychology, which is first and foremost a methodological renewal. In his lectures, Introduction to Philosophy 1922-1923, Husserl presents this renewal in the form of an appropriately delimited psychology, a psychology that is phenomenologically oriented and is no longer and can no longer be a naturalistic one. In this sense, in the 1925 lectures on phenomenological psychology, Husserl also states that going in this direction opens up an eidetic science, an essential science of a psychical, Wesenswissenschaft vom Psychischen, that leads to the understanding of a purely introspective phenomenology, rein introspektiven Phenomenologie. Since, as stated by Husserl in Ideas 2, the intention is, I quote, to bring to clarity the phenomenologically original field of the psychical, end quote. In this regard, it's interesting to reflect on one of the questions posed by Heidegger in commenting on Husserl's article for the Encyclopaedia Britannica, 1927. Heidegger asked, in fact, what does the absolute I means as opposite to what is purely psychic? The answer lies once again in the roots of a distinction between psychology and phenomenology. From this perspective, it's particularly useful to clarify the meaning and the task of what Husserl phenomenologically calls psychological reduction. The meaning of Husserl's psychological reduction is fundamentally that of a delimitation of interest to the psychical, to the pure immanence of consciousness. Psychological reduction has, at the same time, Reduktion auf, focus on the psychical, specifically in the form of eidetic reduction directed at the essence of the psychical, and Reduktion von, exclusion from this field of investigation of everything that is not purely psychical. The first explicit occurrence of the expression psychological reduction in the Husserlian thought must be dated back to at least 1918. But implicitly, however, traces of this notion can already be found earlier. In the first volume of Ideas, for example, Husserl refers, without developing it, to a psychological phenomenology in the sense of a description of psychological phenomena that is linked to what is immanently essential, das immanent Wesentliche. In order to grasp this immanence, neither the abstraction nor the simple internal experience commonly enacted by classical psychology are sufficient. Rather, what is needed is a phenomenological reduction. This purely psychic dimension, grasped in its own essence, reveals itself to be not merely egological, but rather intersubjective and even capable of transforming itself into transcendental. What is purely psychic, in fact, can change its status through appropriate operations of method that inhibit mundane assumptions. What then does it mean to implement a psychological reduction in Husserl's phenomenological perspective? We can say we start with the attitude of psychological reduction, which is indeed in common with psychology, but only partially, because phenomenological investigation, with its sharp gaze, goes further. The turning point is to be found in the reflection on the consciousness-world correlation. By criticizing naturalistic and sensualistic psychology, Husserl has repeatedly emphasized that only the new phenomenology is capable of providing a fruitful treatment of intentionality, recognizing it as the fundamental Grundform of experiences. Phenomenology, so understood, I quote from a 1921 manuscript, disclosed the way to the intersubjective spiritual dimension, Geistigkeit, in its purity and unity, and then founded on the basis of this pure and universal experience of the spirit, an a priori structural doctrine, Strukturenlehre, end quote. According to Husserl, a great defect of historical psychology has been precisely its inability to recognize this spiritual dimension. In this sense, psychology, in order to be scientific, needs a phenomenology of animality, Phenomenologie der Animalität, says Husserl, which for Husserl is nothing other than a phenomenology of what is living, of what is endowed with a soul. We ultimately need a phenomenological psychology. It's in this context that the psychological reduction is to be read and interpreted. Particularly relevant in this regard is what Husserl writes in The Crisis of the European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology, where he interprets the path of the psychology the path of internal observation, Innenbetrachtung, as a path to learn how to see phenomenologically. So we start with a natural psychological attitude and we reduce to the authentically immanent interiority. So we grasp the psychic in its essence, free from all the mundane presupposition, and by means of a radical constitutive analysis, we go back to the sources of meaning by unveiling the intentionality of consciousness, which ultimately turns out to be absolute, transcendentally pure consciousness. And going in this direction, Husserl then goes so far as to consider in paragraph 72 of the Crisis not only plausible but even inevitable the identification of a certain form of psychology with transcendental philosophy. But it's a particular identification, a Wechselbild auf Deutsch, in which psychology, even if it's not annulled, must be transfigured in order to be preserved. Wechselbild. So, the third part is on the psychic. In the light of the above considerations, we can affirm that a certain type of psychology has a phenomenologically expendable function, but we still have to clarify what the psychical examined in the phenomenological psychological investigation actually is. It's not enough to state that it's something that goes beyond what it's experienced at the spatial material level. It's necessary to investigate what this surplus is, this Überschuss. First of all, it must be acknowledged that the psychical as object of investigation admits different levels of consideration. Husserl himself, already in his 1910 lectures, emphasized the need to distinguish under the generic title of psychical a psychic empirical and a psychic transcendental dimension, highlighting the lack of this second aspect in traditional psychology. As Husserl says in the second volume of Ideas, the authentic concept of a psychical is indeed to be derived from experience, but not as a merely empirical procedure, but rather as a consideration by means of eidetic intuition of the essence of what is empirically experienced as psychical. But how, then, should the psychological investigation of the psychic be configured in order to lead to phenomenology? As already pointed out, psychology operates in abstraction in order to address what is purely psychic. And in this sense, psychology will be able to perform within subjectivity a reduction to the real component, a reduction to the real immanence of a psychic. But what belongs to a psychic component as such? Husserl includes in it everything that is commonly linked to the sphere of acts, feelings, positions. I quote, and I want to quote. Okay. We can define as psychic everything that is essentially proper to a person, all his or her real internal characteristics. The psychic is first and foremost psychic life, the flow of personal affections, actions, states of the ego, on the other hand, personal capacities as the ability to perform these acts as permanent habitualities that are realized in a temporal personal way as act, state, affection. End quote. This is a quote from a 1925 manuscript of Husserl. It follows from this that psychology unfolds first and foremost as individual psychology, also defined as psychology of the individual or ecology, insofar as precisely the investigation that is carried out in it is directed at the individual subject, considered in itself solely and uniquely as an individual who, I quote, ideally speaking, would still remain a subject and the same individual, even if the predicates of his social function were to be lacking, end quote. It's necessary, however, to clarify how far such an investigation confined to what is purely psychic of the individual level can go. Among the many questions, a central one concerns the temptation of psychomonism. Particularly significant in this regard is a passage from the third volume of Ideas in which Husserl wonders whether every time we come across the terms consciousness and lived experience, we should actually think we are in the realm of psychology, with the consequence of being led to think that psychology is all-encompassing. Husserl observes that we form the term psychic from the natural attitude and from the word that is pre-given in it, but we use it to denote everything subjective that we perceive in ourselves and, through empathy, Einfühlung, in the others. Everything that characterizes the interiority of a human being in general. As Husserl writes in 1921, all that is placed in the world as really connected to the physical dimension, all that in it exceeds that dimension while being intertwined with it, all that is psychic. Such a broad concept of the psychic cannot simply coincide with consciousness. We need to further circumscribe it in order to enucleate its essence in the strict sense. So, the relationship between psyche and consciousness, for example, is a complex issue, certainly not resolvable by appealing to the exact method of the natural sciences. According to Husserl, what in the natural attitude is seen as part of nature, the psyche with the ego-consciousness, as the peculiar characteristic of allowing itself to be reduced phenomenologically. This means that by putting out of play in oneself and in the others every natural position and judgment related to a psychic dimension, we obtain what is purely immanent, which, as such, is not nature. In this regard, in the following passage contained in the second part of a manuscript from the late 1920s, Husserl says as follows. Just a moment. Okay. The human being as psyche, Seele, spirit, Geist, in accordance with a sense of experience, is not a stream of data without the ego, iklos. It's rather the stream of life in which the identical ecological subject lives. End quote. However, in Husserl's opinion, the subject understood in this way has not been grasped by traditional psychology. A poor understanding of a psychic has also invalidated the understanding of the essence of personality and personal operations, since, I quote from a 1927 text, to what is purely psychic, das rein seelische, also belongs what is purely personal, das rein personell. End quote. To the poor essence of a psyche, Husserl leads in fact both the polarization of the ego and, indeed, I quote from Ideas 2, the necessity of a development in which the I develops into a person and as a person. To the essence of this development belongs the fact that the I as a person is constituted in the psyche through self-experience. End quote. Nevertheless, it should be clarified that the personal subject does not coincide with consciousness, deckt sich nicht, and that the psyche is not the I, die Seele ist nicht das Ich. But the psyche has the merit of being what essentially determines the concept of the I. All this should be known by an authentically pure intentional eidetic psychology, so a phenomenological psychology. And what is the spirit? Husserl distinguishes between psyche as objective reality and psyche as spirit, Geistesseele. In the latter case, we deal with the spiritual basis, Geistesunterlage, for the constitution of the psyche itself. So we can read passage. Psyche, in this sense, is not defined as a real unit in relation to the circumstances of objective nature, not therefore in the psychophysical sense, or need to be so defined. Spirit is not an abstract I of the acts that take a position. Rather, I, the full personality, I, human being, the I that takes a position, the I that thinks, evaluates, acts, performs, works, and so on. To me, therefore, belongs a substratum of lived experiences and a substratum of passive nature, my nature, that manifests itself in the mechanism of lived experiences. This passive nature is the psychic in the sense of physiological natural psychology, but it extends into the very sphere of position. End quote. This is a quote from 1922-1923 Lessons Introduction to Philosophy. Husserl insists on emphasizing how the various aspects of the psychic are intertwined and interdependent. In general, to define, as we have seen, the psychic in terms of surplus with respect to what is physical is to affirm that in the human being the psyche is what exceeds, überschuss, is living corporeity, is co-present, mit da, which, however, does not have in itself the word to which the human being refers. Or rather, the human being has it intentionally, as an appearance, Erscheinung, as a certain phenomenon in his psyche. The psyche that turns out to be the unity of lived experiences with an intentional pole that guarantees the very identity of the human subject in the variation of his phenomena. This consideration gives rise to further questions concerning the concept of ego, psyche, stream of consciousness, and their reciprocal relations. In this regard, Husserl, first of all, clarifies that since every experience is lived by an I that is not itself a lived experience, a stream of lived experiences without an I will be unthinkable. The I belongs inextricably to the psyche. This does not mean that the ego is dissolved in the psyche. One of the tasks of phenomenological investigation is precisely to analyze and clarify this distinction between the I and the psychic substratum, as well as the relationship between the I and the flow of lived experiences. When considering the entire realm of subjectivity with all that pertains to it, from Husserl's point of view, we could bring everything under the broader title of psychology, but only if the latter is methodologically modified. From the above, we should be allowed to speak here about a phenomenological psychology, the only one capable of offering an adequate analysis of interiority, that interiority for which different terms are used in Husserl. These terms are certainly not interchangeable, but in any case they are not used in an exclusive way. They are complementary, depending on the different aspects we wish to highlight in the investigation of interiority: immanence, consciousness, psyche, spirit, personality, pure subjectivity, pure self, and so on. Precisely because no naive discourse on the psychical is permitted in phenomenology, Husserl states that interiority is not just a stream of consciousness with a poor eye. And going deep in the investigation of a psychical dimension, he also comes to the following question. To what extent does the eiletic dimension can be considered as psychical? This is a question about the extent of the data of sensation, for which Husserl also used the term Material, Stoff auf Deutsch, in the first volume of Ideas. Can we consider this data as a non-intentional real moment of a lived experience within the psychical dimension? The answer, according to Husserl, is to be sought in the very structure of a stream of consciousness, where we can find two layers, Schichte, at the level of lived experiences. The material one, the layer of the data of sensation, eiletic, and the specifically noetic one. According to Husserl, both of them are enclosed in the concept of psychic in the broad sense. In the second volume of Ideas, this stratification at the psychic level is also presented as a multi-layered structure within the psyche itself that does not, however, undermine its essential infragmentability, Unterstützbarkeit. We can therefore speak of a certain division, Teilung, of a psyche only as a differentiation into psychic layers, Seelenschichten. Husserl even outlines a threefold stratification of a psychic. Psychophysical, or rather physio-psychic side, to indicate the dependence of the psyche on the living body and on physical nature. Idiopsychic side, the fact that consciousness is, so to speak, dependent on itself, in the sense of reciprocal connections between lived experiences, which in themselves are units of the flow of immanent time. Finally, the dependency relations of psychic reality at the intersubjective level, since not everything that is psychic is specifically egological, and indeed the psychic itself is co-determined by the entire psychic connection, Seelenzusammenhang. Even the occasional use of the term soul in Husserl should not be misleading. When phenomenology speaks of the soul, it does so in a completely not metaphysical manner. From the Husserlian point of view, we can say as follows, and I just came to conclusion. In light of what emerged during this inquiry, we can state that from a Husserlian point of view, a psychology of pure psychic interiority, if conducted in a rigorous and radical manner, fulfills the task of being the gateway to transcendental phenomenology. According to Husserl, we would have to be truly blind not to recognize that already here, at this level, we move on an absolute ground of experience in itself prime, that of transcendental consciousness. This does not mean that we confuse the two disciplines. On the contrary, the difference between phenomenology and psychology must never be eliminated, not even in the case of pure psychology as an authentic eidetic discipline of the spirit, which Husserl also calls sometimes rational psychology in a new sense. On the other hand, however, while remaining in this fundamental distinction, it's precisely by taking the psychological way that the field of inquiry peculiar to transcendental phenomenology is opened up, progressively and without the limitation of the Cartesian approach. In this process, there is an intermediate step represented by phenomenological psychology, which is the level that allows us to speak in Husserl of a phenomenology of interiority. As Husserl says in his 1925 lectures, and we can read, I quote, "Our task must not be to construct the idea of an empirical psychology, but to prepare, through the construction of the idea of a psychology of a purely a priori interiority, as a science in itself enclosed, every general and principal understanding of the essence of what is spiritual, which in itself is one of the highest aims of scientific aspiration. End quotes. From this perspective, an authentic phenomenological psychology in the sense of a purely immanent and a priori psychology has already in itself only hidden verborgen the transcendental. The analysis that concerns the interiority of a human being would then be analysis that admit a certain duplicity of meaning, Zweideutigkeit. They can be read as phenomenological psychological as well as phenomenological transcendental. In this respect, Fink, in his outline for the continuation of the crisis, argued that, I quote, "After all, there is no psychology that can remain psychology. Once the method for disclosing intentionality has been found, psychology must flow into transcendental philosophy." End quote. Fink went even farther, but Husserl himself expressed it several times in similar terms. It's thus clear that from Husserl's perspective, the way traced by pure psychology highlights the psychic interiority in its essence and the intentional implication it contains, facilitating the access to the transcendental. As we have seen in the course of this article, a good psychology that focuses on the psychic without settling for a simple abstraction, but rather by making the phenomenological method of reduction its own, this psychology becomes a full-fledged phenomenological psychology and allows the carrying out of a true phenomenological investigation of interiority. Certainly, the reduction to the psychic interiority is not yet transcendentality, but as Husserl explicitly wrote in 1929, I quote, "If a phenomenological psychology, namely is a radical, completely coherent psychology of a purely psychic interiority of a human being, were to be realized, it would at the same time produce a way. The transcendental turns this entire psychology into transcendental, and fundamentally the transcendental turn must in itself appear under eidetic possibilities as a possible psychic event. If the psychologist realizes this possibility in himself as actual, he is already becoming a phenomenologist, if only he thinks coherently in depth." End quote. And again, as Husserl remarked some years later, I quote, "To explain psychological subjectivity in what characterizes it and impurity, to go beyond the vague form of knowledge in the apperception I as a person and as a subject of my entire life of consciousness, all this means developing a phenomenological and also eidetic psychology of interiority, and thus being driven to the other side into transcendental phenomenology." End quote. We can therefore conclude by stating that Husserl considers not only possible but even desirable a phenomenology of interiority through the development of the idea of a psychology of pure phenomenological interiority. Psychologie rein phenomenologischer Innerlichkeit, which means precisely a phenomenological psychology. So, thank you for your attention.